Welcome to this engaging chat about the multifaceted debate over animal rights. We're diving deeply into how humans interact with animals, whether it's through rescue efforts, meat consumption, or pushing for broader systemic change.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating how polarized the conversation can be, with one side emphasizing individual acts of compassion and the other demanding radical system overhaul, right?
Yeah, exactly. On one hand, we have what I'd call animal welfare enthusiasts who focus on that personal, tangible impact, like rescuing a lone rooster found abandoned by the roadside and ensuring it gets a safe haven.
Yep.
They really believe that these small rescues make a meaningful difference.
And on the flip side, we have activists who argue that isolated acts, while heartfelt, don't really address the massive scale of exploitation out there, especially when you consider, say, battery cages for hens.
Right, yup. And they're more about, well, liberating entire groups of animals, think dozens of hens or even more, from the constraints of industrial farm practices. It's a debate between incremental compassion and full-on systemic upheaval.
It's kind of like comparing fixing a leaky faucet to ripping out the entire plumbing system, isn't it?
Exactly. It's like, addressing a small problem in your home versus rebuilding the whole house when you see signs of a larger structural issue.
I see that analogy working. Each approach has its merits and challenges. So in the context of animal rights, what do we make of the ethics of meat consumption?
That really is one of the flashpoints. On one side, you have enthusiasts who suggest that meat consumption can be ethical if it's done sustainably, like supporting small farms where animals are grass-fed and raised with care.
Yeah.
They argue that while no system is entirely free of issues, there's a practical compromise here.
But the activists counter by saying that any act of killing is fundamentally a moral failure. They point to, for instance, the emotional lives of animals with strong bonds, like cows mourning their calves.
Right. And for them, the idea is that if plant-based alternatives exist, why continue with meat at all? It's like they're saying, why perpetuate any form of violence when there are humane substitutes available?
Yeah, and that's where you see the tension, moderated consumption versus total abstinence.
And it's not just about ethical considerations. It's also about scale. Check out this staggering fact. Globally, around 70 billion animals are killed yearly for food, roughly 200 million per day.
Wow, that's massive. Absolutely, those numbers really drive home the magnitude of industrial animal agriculture. It makes you wonder, though, where do these vast figures fit in the argument for someone advocating incremental changes versus someone demanding revolutionary shifts?
Good point. The welfare enthusiasts would argue that every individual animal saved, like that one rooster or a few hens, represents a concrete victory. However, activists emphasize that these isolated victories barely scratch the surface of the problem when industrial systems are accountable for almost all, like 99%, of the meat production in the U.S.
And when you look at the environmental impact too, livestock accounts for something like 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, according to UN estimates. It really paints a picture of massive systemic exploitation.
That's right. It's this dual approach where you weigh immediate, small-scale welfare improvements against the backdrop of massive environmental and ethical costs from industrial farming.
You know, I've always wondered if there's a middle ground here. Can we really, say, support small farms and lab-grown meat as practical steps? Or is it all just a drop in the bucket compared to what's happening on the industrial scale?
Well, it's a really interesting question. On one side, lab-grown meat is presented as this futuristic solution that could potentially allow for the enjoyment of meat without the animal slaughter aspect.
That's appealing.
But activists might argue that even framing any kind of meat consumption as acceptable perpetuates the idea that animals exist merely as commodities.
Right, which brings us to another controversial perspective. Some activists even go as far as comparing pet ownership to a form of slavery. It's a radical stance, but it underscores their belief in total animal liberation over domestication.
Absolutely. And that's where the debate really heats up. Revised ethics aside, when you consider the statistics, like the routine mutilations on animals in factory farms and the environmental toll, it suggests that even ethical meat from small farms is, in their eyes, just a band-aid solution to a much deeper wound.
Sure, but don't you think that these small-scale interventions might at least shift public sentiment, which could then pressure larger system changes over time?
That's a compelling argument, definitely. Many believe in the value of gradual reform. They say, look, if you can convince people to alter their habits, even a small shift from daily meat consumption to occasional indulgence, that's progress. However, activists would respectfully challenge that notion by insisting that timid reforms only prolong the suffering embedded in industrial systems.
Yeah, I get that. Would you say there's a potential risk that these small steps might lull society into a false sense of achievement while allowing industrial systems to continue harming millions of animals?
Absolutely. That's part of the critique. It's like, if you fix one leak when the whole dam is compromised, you never really solve the problem. There's a real danger that focusing on isolated welfare wins could detract from the push for a complete systemic overhaul.
That's a strong perspective. It makes me wonder if, in our quest for compassion, we need to balance both the immediate good and long-term strategic impact.
Right. It's a delicate balance. The challenge lies in addressing the immediate suffering while not losing sight of the considerable scale of the problem. The numbers, 70 billion animals a year, 200 million a day, and especially those staggering environmental impacts, demand that we really question the status quo.
Exactly. When we drill down to ethics, it's almost philosophical. We're asking, if every animal is sentient and capable of affection, pain, and even mourning, can we ever justify their mass exploitation on any grounds?
Yeah, we're really talking about redefining our human-animal relationships. Enthusiasts might say that humane, sustainable choices can coexist with meat consumption, whereas activists see any exploitation as irredeemable. It really becomes a debate over whether coexistence is acceptable or if liberation is the only ethical path.
And there's also the technological angle, right? With lab-grown meat promising a future where animal suffering might be minimized. But then activists argue that it's still a commodification of animal life.
Exactly. Lab-grown meat is kind of like a compromise solution, a technical fix that, on the surface, sounds brilliant, but might still reinforce the notion that animals are simply resources for our consumption. It opens up a philosophical debate on whether our technological advances can truly address the ethical dilemmas inherent in these practices.
And when you think about it, the deep emotional connection many animals have, like the bonds they form with each other, or even their capacity for grief, complicates the whole issue. It challenges the idea of animals as mere products.
Absolutely. The scientific studies showing that, say, cows and pigs experience real emotions really push the argument. It's no longer just numbers. It's about the quality of life and emotional well-being.
Exactly. However, I sometimes wonder if the activists' approach might alienate those who are open to incremental change. Isn't there a risk that too much radical rhetoric could end up polarizing the conversation even further?
That's a very valid critique. While the passion for total liberation is understandable, especially in the face of staggering cruelty, there's a danger that it could push potential allies away who might otherwise support pragmatic reforms. It's a contentious balance between inspiring urgent change and making incremental progress that reaches a broader audience.
Exactly, and in a way, both perspectives share the same end goal, a reduction in animal suffering. But they differ fundamentally in strategy.
Right, and perhaps that's why this debate remains so enduring. The core facts are undeniable. Mass industrial practices, high emotional cost, and significant environmental impacts. Yet the path forward is mired in these divergent strategies, one based on individualized rescues and another on wholesale systemic change.
It really does leave the audience with a lot to think about regarding where their sympathies lie and what kind of change they want to see implemented.
Yep, it's a provocative collision of ideas. One person saying, save one life, and another insisting, we need to dismantle the whole system. Each approach confronts us with tough questions about ethics, practicality, and our moral responsibilities.
Right on. And that ultimately is what makes the animal rights debate so complex and, frankly, engaging. It challenges us to think critically about our values, the impact of our choices, and the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. Whether through small rescues or advocating for revolutionary change, the conversation pushes us to reflect deeply on humanity's relationship with animals and on finding a balance between immediate care and long-term systemic reform.
Absolutely. Thanks for this dynamic discussion. It's clear that while the data paints an alarming picture, the debate itself is a call to action, urging all of us to think more compassionately about our choices.
Yep, thanks for being part of this chat. Until next time, it's about keeping the conversation going and questioning, how we can truly make a lasting difference for animals everywhere.